On his return to work, Viktor found Sokolov absent from the laboratory. He'd caught pneumonia 2 days before. Viktor learnt that before his illness, he and Shishakov had agreed that he should be transferred to a different post. In the end, he'd been appointed director of another laboratory that was currently being reorganized. Evidently, he was doing well. Even the omniscient Markov was ignorant of the true reasons behind Sokolov's request to be transferred. Viktor felt no regret. He found it painful to think of meeting Sokolov, let alone working with him. Who knows what Sokolov would have read in Viktor's eyes? Certainly Viktor had no right to think as he did about the wife of his friend. He had no right to be longing for her. He had no right to meet her in secret. If he had heard a similar story about someone else, he'd have felt quite indignant. Deceiving one's wife. Deceiving a friend. But he did long for her. He did dream of meeting her. Lyudmila and Maria Ivanovna were now seeing each other again. They had had a long telephone conversation and then met. They had both cried, each accusing herself of meanness, suspiciousness, and lack of faith in their friendship. How complicated life was. Maria Ivanovna, pure, honest Maria Ivanovna, had been insincere and deceitful with Lyudmila, but only because of her love for him. Viktor very seldom saw Maria Ivanovna now. Most of what he knew about her came from Lyudmila. He learnt that Sokolov had been proposed for a Stalin Prize on the strength of some papers he had published before the war, that he had received enthusiastic letter from some young physicists in England, that he might be chosen as a corresponding member of the Academy at the next elections. All this was what Maria Ivanovna told Lyudmila. During his own brief meetings with her, he never so much as mentioned Pyotr Lavrentrievich. His work in the laboratory, his journeys and meetings were never enough to take his mind off her. He wanted to see her the whole time. Lyudmila said several times, I just don't understand what Sokolov's got against you now. Even Masha can't explain it." The explanation, of course, was simple enough, but it was impossible for Maria Ivanovna to share it with Lyudmila. It was quite enough that she had told her husband of her feelings for Viktor. This confession had destroyed the friendship between Viktor and Sokolov forever. She had promised her husband not to go on seeing Viktor. If she were to say one word to Lyudmila, she would be cut off from Viktor completely. He wouldn't know whether she was, or where she was, or what she was doing. They met so seldom as it was, and their meetings were so brief. They spoke very little even when they did meet. They just walked down the street arm in arm and sat in silence on a park bench. At the time of Viktor's troubles, she had understood his feelings with a quite extraordinary sensitivity. She had been able to guess what he would think and what he would do. She had seemed able to anticipate all that was about to happen to him. The gloomier he had felt, the more passionately he had longed to see her. This perfect understanding of hers had seemed to him to be his only happiness. He had felt that with her beside him, he could easily bear all his sufferings. With her, he could be happy. They had talked together one night in Kazan. They had gone for a walk in a Moscow park. They had sat together for a few moments in a square off Kaluga Street, and that was all. And then there was a present, a few telephone calls, and a few brief meetings he hadn't told Lyudmila about. Viktor knew, however, that his sin and her sin couldn't be measured by the number of minutes they'd sat together on the bench. His was no mean sin. He loved her. How had she come to occupy such an important place in his life? Every word he said to his wife was partly a lie. He couldn't help it. There was something deceitful in his every movement, in every look he gave her. With affected indifference, he would ask her, "Well, did your friend ring today? How is she? And is Pyotr Lavrentrievich well?" He felt glad of Sokolov's successes, but not because he felt any goodwill towards him. No, it was because he felt it gave Maria Ivanovna the right not to feel guilty. He found it unbearable to hear about Sokolov and Maria Ivanovna only through Lyudmila. It was humiliating for Lyudmila, for Maria Ivanovna, and for himself. He was conscious of something false, even when he talked to Lyudmila about Nadia, Tolya, and Alexandra Vladimirovna. There were lies everywhere. Why was this? How had it happened? His love for Maria Ivanovna was the deepest truth of his soul. How could it have given birth to so many lies? It was only by renouncing his love that he could deliver himself, Lyudmila, and Maria Ivanovna from these lies. But when he realized this is what he had to do, he was dissuaded by a treacherous fear that clouded his judgment. This lie isn't so very terrible. What harm does it do anyone? Suffering is more terrible than lying. And when he felt he was strong and ruthless enough to break with Lyudmila and ruin Sokolov's life, this same treacherous fear egged him on with a contradictory argument. Nothing can be worse than deceit. It'd be better to break with Lyudmila altogether than to go on lying to her all the time. And making Maria Ivanovna lie to her. Deceit is more terrible than suffering. Victor wasn't aware that his intelligence was now merely the obedient servant of his emotions, and that there was only one way of escaping from this circle of confusion, by using the knife, by sacrificing himself rather than others. The more he thought about it all, the less he understood. How could he unravel this tangle? How could his love for Maria Ivanovna be the truth of his life and at the same time its greatest lie? Only last summer he had had an affair with the beautiful Nina, and they had done more than just walk around the square like schoolchildren who had fallen in love. But it was only now that he felt a sense of guilt and betrayal, a sense of having done wrong to his family. All this consumed an incalculable amount of emotional and intellectual energy, probably as much as Planck had expended in elaborating his quantum theory. He'd once thought that his love had been born only of sorrow and tragedy, but now he was on the crest of the wave, and he needed Maria Ivanovna as much as ever. She was unlike everyone else. She wasn't attracted in the least by power, riches, and fame. She had wanted to share his grief, anxiety, and deprivation. Would she turn away from him now? He knew that Maria Ivanovna worshipped Pyotr Lev-Andreevich. Sometimes this drove him almost insane. Yevgenia was probably right. This second love, born after the years of married life, must be the result of a vitamin deficiency of the soul. He was like a cow licking salt after searching for it for years in grass, hay, and the leaves of trees. This hunger of the soul grew very slowly, but in the end it was irresistible. Yes, that's what it was, a hunger of the soul. Maria Ivanovna was indeed startlingly different from Lyudmila. Was this really so? Victor didn't realize that these thoughts had nothing to do with his reason, that their truth or falsehood had nothing to do with how he acted. If he didn't see Maria Ivanovna, he was unhappy. If he knew he was going to see her, he was happy. And when he imagined a future in which they were inseparably together, he felt still more happy. Why didn't he feel a twinge of guilt about Sokolov? Why did he feel no shame? But what was there to be ashamed of? All they'd done was walk through a park and sit down for a while on a bench. Oh, no, it wasn't just a matter of sitting on a bench. He was ready to break with Lyudmila. He was ready to tell Sokolov that he loved his wife and wanted to take her from him. He remembered everything that had gone wrong between him and Lyudmila, how badly he had treated his mother, how badly she had treated his mother, how she had refused to let his cousin stay the night after his release from camp, how rude and callous, how cruel and obstinate she had sometimes been. All this made him feel callous himself, and that was what he needed to feel if he was to be ruthless. But Lyudmila had spent her life with him. She had shared all his troubles and difficulties. Her hair was going grey. She had suffered. Was there really nothing good in her? He had been proud of her in the past. He had loved her strength and honesty. Yes, he was simply nerving himself to be ruthless. As he was getting ready to go out in the morning, Victor remembered Yevgenia's visit and thought, all the same, it's a good thing she's back in Krybyshev. Just then, as Victor was feeling ashamed at being so mean, Lyudmila said, "So, now Nikolay's been arrested as well. How many of our family does it make? At least Yevgenia's not in Moscow anymore." Victor wanted to reproach her, but stopped himself in time. That would have been too dishonest. "Oh yes, Chepitsin phoned," said Lyudmila. Victor looked at his watch. "I'll be back early this evening. I'll ring him then. By the way, I'm probably going to the Urals again." "Will you be there long?" "No, just 2 or 3 days." He was in a hurry. Today was an important day. His work was important, even to the state. But his private thoughts were mean, petty, and trivial. It was as though they were in inverse proportion. As she was leaving, Yevgenia had asked Lyudmila to go to Kuznetsky Most and hand over 200 roubles for Krimov. "Lyudmila," said Victor, "don't forget the money Zenya gave you. I think you've left it too late already." He didn't say this because he was worried on behalf of Krimov or Yevgenia. He said it because he was afraid that Lyudmila's negligence might bring Yevgenia back to Moscow again. Then she'd start making telephone calls, sending off petitions and statements. In the end, his flat would be nothing but a centre for agitation on behalf of political prisoners. Victor knew he was being both petty and cowardly. Feeling ashamed of himself, he said hurriedly, "You must write to Zenya. Invite her to stay in my name. Maybe she needs to come to Moscow, but feels awkward about asking. Yes, Luda, write her straight away." He felt better after that. But then he knew it was only for his own peace of mind that he'd said it. How strange everything was. When he'd just sat in his room all day, a pariah, afraid even of the house manager and the girl at the rations desk, his head had been full of thoughts about life, truth, and freedom, thoughts about God. That was when no one had wanted him. When the telephone had been silent for weeks on end, and people had ignored him if they passed him on the street. But now, when dozens of people waited on him, phoning him up and writing to him, when a ZIS 101 came to pick him up and hooted discreetly beneath the window, now he found it impossible to shed himself of petty anxieties, trivial irritations, and thoughts that were emptier than the husks of sunflower seeds. He'd said the wrong thing then. He'd laughed at the wrong moment there. Yes, he was obsessed by trivia. For a while after Stalin's telephone call, he had thought that he need never know fear again, but it was still there. Only its outer trappings had changed. Now it was simply a more aristocratic fear, a fear that travelled by car and was allowed to use the Kremlin telephone switchboard. And what had once been unimaginable, an attitude of envious rivalry towards the achievements and theories of other scientists, had begun to seem quite normal. He was like an athlete, afraid of being overtaken, afraid that someone might beat his record. He didn't really want to talk to Chepitsin now. He didn't have the strength for what would be a long and difficult conversation. He and Chepitsin had oversimplified when they talked about the dependence of science on the state. He himself was quite free. No one any longer thought of his theories as absurdities straight out of the Talmud. No one dared attack them now. The state needed theoretical physics. Badin and Shishakov understood that now. For Markov to show him his true talent for setting up experiments, for Kochkurov to show his talent for seeing their practical applications, you needed a theoretician. Now, after Stalin's telephone call, that was generally understood. But how could he explain to Dmitri Petrovich that this telephone call had brought him freedom? Why had he suddenly become so intolerant of Lyudmila's failings? And why was he now so well disposed towards Shishakov? He'd grown particularly fond of Markov. Perhaps because he had now become genuinely interested in the personal lives of his bosses, in everything secret or half-secret, in every act of harmless cunning or outright treachery, in all the various humiliations arising from invitations or absence of invitations to the Presidium, in who figured on a special list, or who merely heard the fateful words, "You're not on the list." Yes, he'd much sooner spend a free evening chatting with Markov than be arguing with Madyarov at one of their Kazan gatherings. Markov had an extraordinarily sharp eye for people's absurdities. He could make fun of their weaknesses lethally, but without malice. His mind was very elegant, and he was a first-class scientist. He was possibly the most talented experimental physicist in the country. Victor already had his coat on when Lyudmila said, "Maria Ivanovna phoned yesterday." "Oh, yes," said Victor immediately. His face must have changed. "What's the matter?" asked Lyudmila. "Oh, nothing at all," he said, coming back into the room. I didn't quite understand. Some unpleasantness at the Institute. I think Kovchenko phoned them. Anyway, it's the usual story. She's worried about you. She's afraid you're going to put your foot in it again." "How?" asked Victor impatiently. "I don't understand." "I don't understand myself. I've already told you. She evidently didn't want to go into it at length on the phone." "Tell me all that again," said Victor. He unbuttoned his coat and sat down on a chair by the door. Lyudmila looked at him, shaking her head from side to side. He thought her eyes seemed sad and reproachful, as though to confirm this. Lyudmila said, "Vitya, you didn't have time to phone Chepitsin, but you're always ready to hear about dear Masha, aren't you? I thought you were late." Victor gave her an odd, sideways look and said, "Yes, I am late." He went up to her, took her hand and kissed it. She patted him on the head and ruffled his hair. You see how interesting and important Masha's become?" said Lyudmila quietly. She gave a wry smile and added, "The same Masha who couldn't tell the difference between Balzac and Flaubert." Victor looked at her. Her eyes were moist, her lips almost trembling. He shrugged his shoulders helplessly and walked out. In the doorway he turned round again. He felt quite shaken by the look on Lyudmila's face. It was a look of utter exhaustion, touching helplessness and shame, both on his behalf and on her own. On his way down the stairs he thought that if he were to break with Lyudmila and never see her again, he would remember that look until his dying day. He realized that something very important had just happened. His wife had informed him that she knew of his love for Maria Ivanovna, and he had confirmed it. All he knew for sure was that if he saw Masha, he felt happy, and if he promised himself never to see her again, he felt he could hardly breathe. As Victor's car arrived at the Institute, Shishakov drew up alongside it. The two cars stopped by the door almost simultaneously. Victor and Shishakov then walked side by side down the corridor. Shishakov took Victor by the arm. "Are you going to the Urals, then?" "I think so." "Soon we'll be saying goodbye for good. You'll become an independent sovereign," said Shishakov with a smile. "What if I ask if he's ever been in love with someone else's wife?" thought Victor suddenly. "Oh, Victor Pavlovitch," said Shishakov, "can you come round to my office about 2 o'clock?" "Certainly, I'll be free by then." Victor found it hard to concentrate on his work that morning. In the laboratory, Markov came up to him in his shirt sleeves and said excitedly, "If you'll allow me, Victor Pavlovitch, I'll come and see you a bit later. I've got something interesting to tell you." "I'm seeing Shishakov at 2, said Victor. "Come round after that. I've got something to tell you myself." "You're seeing Alexey Alexeyevich," said Markov thoughtfully. "I think I know what about." Seeing Victor come in, Shishakov said, "I was just going to phone and remind you of our meeting." Victor looked at his watch. "I'm not late, am I?" Shishakov looked quite enormous as he stood there in his grey suit, his huge head covered in silvery hair. But his eyes no longer seemed cold and arrogant. They were more like the eyes of a little boy brought up on Dumas and Mayne Reid. "My dear Victor Pavlovitch, I've got something important to discuss with you," said Chichikov with a smile. He took Victor by the arm and led him towards an easy chair. "It's something very serious and rather unpleasant." "Well," said Victor, looking mournfully around the office, "let's get down to it, then." "What's happened," Chichikov began, "is that a disgusting campaign's been started up abroad, mainly in England. In spite of the fact that we're bearing nearly the whole weight of the war on our own shoulders, certain English scientists, instead of demanding the immediate opening of a second front, have begun an extraordinary campaign with the aim of arousing hostility towards the Soviet Union." He looked Victor straight in the eye. Victor knew this open, frank look. It was characteristic of people who are doing something dishonest. I see, he said. Well, what exactly is this campaign?" "It's a campaign of slanders," said Chichikov. "They've published a list of Soviet writers and scientists they allege to have been shot. They're making out that some quite fantastic number of people have been imprisoned for political reasons. With extraordinary and really very suspicious vehemence, they contest the verdict, established by due process of law, on doctors Pletnyov and Levin, the assassins of Alexei Maximovich Gorky. All this has been published in a newspaper close to government circles." I see, said Victor. And is that it?" "More or less. There's also something about the geneticist Chetverikov. A committee's been established for his defence." "But, my dear Alexei Alexeyevich, Chetverikov has been arrested." Chichikov shrugged his shoulders. "As I'm sure you're aware, Victor Pavlovitch, I know nothing about the workings of the security organs, but if, as you say, he has been arrested, then it must be with good reason. You and I haven't been arrested, have we?" Just then Badin and Kovchenko came in. Chichikov was evidently expecting them. Victor realized they must have arranged this beforehand. Without stopping to put them in the picture, Chichikov just said, "Sit down, comrade, sit down," and turned back to Victor. "So, Victor Pavlovitch, these slanders have now reached America and been published in the pages of the New York Times. This naturally has aroused indignation among the Soviet intelligentsia." "Of course," said Kovchenko. "What else could one expect?" He looked directly at Victor. His own brown eyes seemed so warm and friendly that Victor was unable to come out with the thought that had immediately occurred to him: how can the Soviet intelligentsia be so indignant if they've never once set eyes on the New York Times? He grunted and shrugged his shoulders. This, he was aware, could be taken as a sign of agreement. "Naturally," Chichikov went on, "a desire has arisen to refute these calumnies, and so we've drawn up a document." "You haven't done anything of the sort," thought Victor. "You weren't even present when it was drawn up." "This document is in the form of a letter." "I've read it myself," added Badin in a quiet voice. "It's just what's needed. We want to have it signed by a small number of our most important scientists, people who are known in Europe and America." Victor had known right from the beginning what all this was leading up to. What he hadn't known was the precise form Chichikov's request would take, whether he'd be asked to write an article, to make a speech at the Scientific Council, to vote. Now it was clear. They wanted his signature at the foot of a letter. He began to feel sick. It was just like when they'd wanted him to make a public confession. He suddenly felt miserable, base, pathetic. Once again, millions of tons of granite were about to come down on his shoulders. Professor Pletnyov, Victor remembered an article in Pravda written by some hysterical woman, full of wild accusations against the old doctor. To begin with, as so often, he had believed it all. Gogol, Tolstoy, Chekhov, and Korolenko appeared to have instilled in Russians an almost religious reverence for the printed word. Finally, however, Victor had realized that it was a calumny. Pletnyov had then been arrested, together with Levin, another famous doctor from the Kremlin hospital. The two of them confessed to having murdered Alexei Maximovich Gorky. The three men were all looking at Victor. Their eyes were warm, friendly, and trusting. They accepted him as one of them. Shishakov looked at him as a brother. He understood the immense significance of Victor's work. Kravchenko looked up to him. Badin's eyes said, "Yes, everything you did and said seemed alien to me, but I was wrong. I didn't understand. The party corrected me." Kravchenko opened a red file and handed Victor a typewritten letter. "Let me say one thing, Victor Pavlovich. This Anglo-American campaign plays straight into the hands of the fascists. It's probably the work of those swine in the fifth column." "There's no need to go on at Victor Pavlovich," Badin interrupted. "He's as much a patriot as any of us. He's a Russian, a true Soviet citizen." "Precisely," said Shishakov. "No one's ever doubted it," said Kravchenko. I see, said Victor. Only a little while ago these people had treated him with suspicion and contempt, but now these professions of trust and friendship came quite naturally to them. And Victor, though he had not forgotten the past, accepted their friendship with the same ease and naturalness. He felt paralyzed by their trust and their kindness. He had no strength. If only they'd shouted at him, kicked him, beaten him, then he would have got angry and recovered his strength. Stalin had spoken to him. They all knew this. But the letter they wanted him to sign was terrible. Nothing could make him believe that Dr. Levin and Professor Pletnyov had killed the great writer. His mother had seen Dr. Levin during one of her visits to Moscow. Lyudmila had been treated by him. He was a kind man, gentle and sensitive. Only a monster could slander these two doctors so appallingly. There was something medieval about these accusations. Assassin doctors. The murderers of a great writer, the last Russian classic. What was the purpose of such slanders? The Inquisition and its bonfires, the execution of heretics, witch trials, boiling pitch, the stench of smoke. What did all this have to do with Lenin, with the construction of socialism and the great war against fascism? Victor began to read the first sheet. Shishakov asked whether he was comfortable and had enough light. Would he rather sit in the armchair? No, thank you. He was quite comfortable as he was. Victor read very slowly. The characters pressed against his mind without penetrating it. They were like sand on the skin of an apple. Your defence of Pletnyov and Levin, degenerates who are a disgrace not only to medicine but to the human race as a whole, is grist to the mill of the anti-human ideology of fascism. The Soviet nation stands alone in its struggle against fascism, the ideology that has brought back medieval witch trials, pogroms, torture chambers, and the bonfires of the Inquisition. How could one read this and not go insane? The blood of our sons shed at Stalingrad marks a turning point in the war with Hitlerism, but you, in coming to the defence of these degenerates, have unwittingly... I see. Nowhere in the world do scientists enjoy the affection of the people and the protective care of the state to the same degree as in the Soviet Union. Victor Pavlovich, it will disturb you if we go on talking? No, not at all, said Victor. At the same time, he was thinking, some lucky people manage to get out of this kind of thing. They fall ill, or they're at their dachas, or... I've heard that Yosef Vissarionovich knows about this letter, said Kravchenko. Apparently he approves of this initiative of our scientists. That's why the signature of Victor Pavlovich, began Badin. Victor felt overwhelmed by disgust at his own submissiveness. The great state was breathing on him tenderly. He didn't have the strength to cast himself out into the freezing darkness. He had no strength today, no strength at all. He was paralyzed, not by fear, but by something quite different, a strange, agonizing sense of his own passivity. How strange man is! Victor had found the strength to renounce life itself, and now he seemed unable to refuse candies and cookies. But how can one just push off an omnipotent hand when it strokes your hair and pats you on the back? Nonsense. Why was he slandering himself like this? It was nothing to do with candies and cookies. He'd always been indifferent to comfort and material well-being. His thoughts, his work, all that was most precious to him, had turned out to be necessary and valuable in the struggle against fascism. That was the true joy. What was all this anyway? The doctors had confessed during the preliminary investigation. They had confessed during the trial itself. How could he believe in their innocence when they themselves had confessed to having murdered a great writer? To refuse to sign the letter would be to show approval of the murder of Gorky. That was unthinkable. Did he doubt that their confessions were genuine? Had they been coerced into making them then? There was only one way of forcing an honourable and intelligent man to confess to being a hired assassin, thereby making himself liable to an infamous execution, and that was torture, and it would be insane even to hint at that. But it was repugnant, quite repugnant, to think of signing this vile letter. All kinds of excuses came to mind, together with the inevitable answers. Comrades, I feel ill. I am suffering cardiac spasms. Nonsense, you look fine. You're just making excuses. Oh, why do you need my signature, comrades? I'm only known to a very narrow circle of specialists. Very few people outside this country know my name. Nonsense. How pleasant to hear that this was nonsense. People abroad do know your name. In any case, it's quite unthinkable to show this letter to Comrade Stalin without your signature on it. You might ask, but why hasn't Strom signed? Comrades, let me say quite frankly, there are certain phrases that seem rather unfortunate. They almost bring into disrepute our whole scientific intelligentsia. Please, Victor Pavlovich, give us your suggestions. We'll be only too delighted to alter any phrases that you consider unfortunate. Please understand, comrades, here it says, the writer Babel, an enemy of the people, the writer Pilniak, an enemy of the people, the director Meyerhold, an enemy of the people, academician Vavilov, an enemy of the people. I'm a theoretical physicist, a mathematician. Some people consider me schizophrenic. My field of study is so abstract. I'm really not competent to judge these other matters. It's best to leave people like me in peace. Nonsense, Victor Pavlovich. You have a logical mind, and you understand politics extremely well. You know yourself how often you talk about politics, and how apt your remarks always are. For the love of God, please understand that I have a conscience. I feel ill. I find all this very painful. I'm under no obligation. Why should I have to sign this letter? I'm exhausted. You must allow me the right to a clear conscience. But he couldn't get away from a sense of impotence, a sense that he had somehow been hypnotized. He was obedient and as well cared for animal. And then there was fear, fear of ruining his life once again, fear of living in fear. Could he really oppose himself to the collective again? Go back to his former solitude? It was time he took the world seriously. He had obtained things he had never even dreamed of. He could work in complete freedom. He was treated with solicitous attentiveness, and he hadn't had to beg for any of this. He hadn't repented. He had been victorious. What more could he ask for? Stalin had telephoned him. Comrades, this is a very serious matter. I need to think about it. Allow me to put off my decision until tomorrow morning. Victor immediately imagined all the torment of a sleepless night. Doubts, indecision, sudden decisiveness followed by terror, more doubts, another decision. All that was so exhausting. It was worse than malaria. Did he really want to prolong such torture? No, he had no strength. It was better to get it over and done with. He took out his pen. As he did so, he saw a look of amazement on Chichikov's face. How docile this rebel had now become. Victor did no work that day. There were no distractions, no telephone calls. He was simply unable to work. His work seemed dull, empty, and pointless. Who else had signed the letter? Chepitsin? Yoffe had, but Krylov? And Mandelstam? He wanted to hide behind someone's back, but it had been impossible for him to refuse. It would have been suicide. Nonsense. He could easily have refused. No, he had done the right thing. But then, no one had threatened him. It would have been all right if he had signed out of a feeling of animal fear, but he hadn't signed out of fear. He had signed out of an obscure, almost nauseous feeling of submissiveness. Victor called Anna Stepanovna to his office and asked her to develop a film for tomorrow. It was a control film of experiments carried out with the new apparatus. She finished noting everything down, but didn't move. Victor looked at her questioningly. "Victor Pavlovich," she began, "I once thought this was impossible to put into words, but I feel I have to say it. Do you realize how much you have done for me and for others? What you've done for us is more important than any great discovery. I feel better just knowing that you exist. Do you know what the mechanics, cleaners, and caretakers say about you? They say that you're an upright man. I often wanted to call at your home, but I was afraid. Do you understand? Even during the most difficult days, I had only to think of you, and everything seemed easier. Thank you for being the man you are." Before Victor had time to say anything, she had left the office. He wanted to run down the street and scream, anything at all, rather than this shame, this torment. But this was only the beginning. Later in the afternoon, his telephone rang. "Do you know who it is?" He did indeed. Even his cold fingers on the receiver seemed to recognize the voice. Once again, Maria Ivanovna had appeared at a critical moment. "I'm speaking from a call box. I can hardly hear you," said Maria Ivanovna. "Pyotr Lavrentievich is feeling better. I've got more time now. If you can, come to the square at 8 o'clock tomorrow." Suddenly her voice changed. "My love, my dearest, my light, I'm afraid for you. Someone came round about a letter, you know the one I mean. I'm sure it was you, your strength, that helped Pyotr Lavrentievich to stand his ground. Anyway, it went all right. But I immediately began thinking how much harm you've probably done yourself. You're so awkward and angular. You always come out bleeding, while everyone else just gets a slight knock." Victor put down the receiver and buried his face in his hands. He now understood the position he was in. It wasn't his enemies who were going to punish him, but his friends, the people who loved him. It was their very faith in him that would wound him. As soon as he got home, he had phoned Chebitsyn. He didn't even take his coat off. As he dialed his number, he felt certain that he would be wounded yet again by his dear friend, by his loving teacher. Lyudmila was standing right there, but he was in too much of a hurry even to tell her what he had done. God, how quickly she was going grey. That's right. Have a go at someone when their hair turns grey. "All right, I've just heard the bulletin on the radio," said Chebitsyn, "but I haven't got much to say about myself. Oh, yes, I quarrelled yesterday with certain prominent officials. Have you heard about this letter yet?" Victor's lips were quite dry. He licked them and said, "Yes, vaguely." Yes, it's not something to talk about on the phone. We can discuss it when we next meet, after your trip," said Chebitsyn. But all this was nothing. Soon Nadia would be back. Heavens, what had he done?